18th century people saw things quite differently. There was not a widespread consensus about things like church and state. Religious minorities were worried, especially those who'd been marginalized the most in colonial society. Strong anti-Catholic sentiment influenced American politics well into the 20th century. As much as Washington had said these things, and as much influence as he had, it just didn't play out that way. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I've made a few 19th century videos and a few 20th century videos, and now I think we need to look a lot further back, and today we're going to talk about the 18th century. And today's video is going to be about George Washington's views of church and state. Now, I don't have the bandwidth this month to give a full overview of George Washington's religious views or even of all of the ins and outs of his views of church and state. But what I do have time for is to talk about three letters that he wrote that were really influential in American understanding of church and state. I actually started out thinking this was going to be a YouTube short because I've made a few YouTube shorts about American presidents, and I also have one I plan to release soon about Millard Fillmore. But I really felt like George Washington needed more than 60 seconds, so here we are. Now, you may not realize this today from our vantage point, especially because of the way that American history tends to be presented to most people in most settings, but it wasn't really clear what kind of country the United States was going to be. That's true for both its basic form of government and also its views of its people's rights under the law. Church and state was one of those things. Our Independence Day is July 4th, which celebrates July 4th, 1776, and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That's when Americans said they were another country, but they weren't really another country until a little while longer. It's just that we're excited about that moment when we decided to be one, or at least a small handful of people decided, and then, the rest was history, as it were. It took a while for the form of government that we have now to take shape. The U.S. Constitution was not the first governing document that the United States attempted to use. The first of the United States governing documents was the Articles of Confederation, but that really didn't hold for very long. And we can skip over a lot of this history because it's not going to help us for our purposes, but I will put a few sources for you to review in my description link. I am always linking to my sources, and you can find those on Patreon. Although it is Patreon, the links to my sources are always free. Those are free posts. It is free to join the Patreon if you want to. Anyway, I will put a link to some sources you can review about the Articles of Confederation. But suffice it to say, they didn't work out, and so we then have the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was ratified by enough states to be considered valid when New Hampshire ratified it in 1788. The Constitution actually took effect on March 9th, 1789, although at that point not all states had ratified it. They eventually did. Rhode Island was the last of the original 13 states to get on board in 1790. At that point, George Washington had already been president for a while, having taken office on April 30th, 1789. But even though we had a constitution, we didn't have the Constitution as we know it today. It did not have a Bill of Rights. Those are amendments. The original Constitution had none of those amendments. And the Bill of Rights is, of course, those 10 amendments that guarantee certain rights under the law. Religious freedom is one of those, considered the First Amendment. There's also the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment, various other rights that are enshrined in our Constitution under those amendments. The Bill of Rights took effect on December 15th, 1791, when enough states had ratified it for them to be considered valid. Here's a bit of historical trivia for you. The original slate of amendments that the House of Representatives approved were not 10, they were 17. And the Senate whittled them down to 12. George Washington sent 12 proposed amendments to the states for ratification, and the first two weren't ratified then. What the original First Amendment said had to do with when the people in Congress could get raises. It wasn't ratified until 1992 and is now considered the 27th Amendment. The original Second Amendment would have specified how many constituents each representative could have in Congress, but that was never ratified. So we have 10 amendments, but the First Amendment was about money, and the Second Amendment was about Congress, not religion and guns. But anyway, they ratified 10 of them. And of course, all of that is a diversion from our purposes here, but I'm a history nerd, and I like to insert obscure random trivia. There was actually quite a bit of debate over what rights Americans would have in a new country. This wasn't a settled thing. There was not a widespread consensus about things like church and state. That being said, the Continental Congress had made a sort of suggestion toward that end in 1776, when they said in a resolution, "Whereas it has been the wise policy of these states to extend the protection of their laws to all those who should settle among them, of whatever nation or religion they might be, and to admit to them a participation in the benefits of all civil and religious freedom." This didn't translate to religious liberty or separation of church and state in the way that you might understand it today. Giving everyone the right to live in any state is not the same as giving them all equal protection under the law. 18th century people saw things quite differently than 21st century Americans. They often, in their individual state constitutions, included things like religious tests for public office and limiting voting rights to Christians or limiting voting rights only to Protestants, for example. Religious minorities were worried, especially those who'd been marginalized the most in colonial society. And that's why George Washington, in that time between the ratification of the U.S. Constitution and the ratification of the Bill of Rights, was receiving mail from religious minorities. The three groups we're going to talk about today, the three groups that sent letters to George Washington, were Baptists, Catholics, and Jews. Baptists had been imprisoned for refusing to pay church taxes, and their marriages were not necessarily recognized as legal, among other things. For Catholics, there was outright discrimination against them as they were not Protestant, and many of the states still wanted to limit voting rights and the right to hold public office to Protestants. And still more would marginalize Jews because they wanted to limit it only to Christians. They might consider Catholics Christians, but Jews definitely weren't included in the in club at that point. So there was not a consensus around church and state, but there was a pretty broad, widespread consensus around George Washington. He won his election with a unanimous vote of the Electoral College. We didn't see that again, even with the really widespread support, at least in terms of the Electoral College, for Ronald Reagan, for example, in 1984, when he secured 525 Electoral College votes. It still wasn't unanimous. 13 votes for Walter Mondale. So Washington's influence was significant, and he would have the most significant influence of any U.S. president because he had that kind of widespread support. Washington provided reassurance to religious minorities who wrote to him. Let's start with the Baptists. The United Baptist Churches of Virginia wrote to Washington in May of 1789. They said they had been distressed by the process of developing a state constitution in Virginia, which was a really fraught process and really a story we could delve into more, but let's just say it had distressed the Baptists. And they said this: "We, as a society, had unusual strugglings of mind, fearing that liberty of conscience, dearer to us than property or life, was not sufficiently secured. Perhaps our jealousies were heightened on account of the usage that we received under the royal government, when mobs, bonds, fines, and prisons were our frequent attendants." But Washington wrote back to put their minds at ease, even after their unusual strugglings. "If I could have entertained the slightest apprehension that the Constitution framed in the convention where I had the honor to preside might possibly endanger the religious rights of any ecclesiastical society, certainly I would never have placed my signature to it. And if I could now conceive that the general government might be so administered as to render the liberty of conscience insecure, I beg you will be persuaded that no one would be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny and every species of religious persecution. For you doubtless remember that I have often expressed my sentiment that every man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience. Now, for Baptists, things worked out pretty well in American history, and that's a story that we can tell at another time. But suffice it to say, the separation of church and state really boosted their membership numbers.
First Baptist became not only the most influential church in Dallas, but soon established itself as one of the most influential churches in the country, and indeed the world. First Baptist constructed a massive, state-of-the-art campus surrounding the original church and encompassing 6 blocks of downtown Dallas.
Washington heard from Catholics as well. America's first Roman Catholic bishop was John Carroll of Baltimore. His brother Daniel had been part of the Constitutional Convention. He was a delegate there, and he was the first congressman from Maryland. Their cousin Charles had signed the Declaration of Independence, and they joined with another Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, who was from Philadelphia, and a merchant from New York, to express their concerns, to write a letter to Washington asking what Catholics might expect under the new government. The other Catholic who had signed the Declaration of Independence was Thomas Fitzsimmons of Philadelphia, and Dominic Lynch, who was the founder of Rome, New York, and a prominent merchant, was also part of this endeavor. They wrote to congratulate Washington on his election as president, but also to express their worries as Catholics about whether they would be free in America. While our country preserves her freedom and independence, we shall have a well-founded title to claim her justice, the equal rights of citizenship. We pray for the preservation of them where they have been granted, and expect their full extension from the justice of those states which still restrict them. Now, this does indicate that Catholics were experiencing discrimination in America, as there were states who still limited their voting rights and rights to hold public office. Around the middle of March 1790, George Washington wrote a letter to the Roman Catholics in the United States of America. Washington expressed optimism for the future, even while maybe acknowledging that things hadn't lived up to his ideals yet. As mankind become more liberal, they will be more apt to allow that all those who conduct themselves as worthy members of the community are equally entitled to the protection of civil government. I hope ever to see America among the foremost nations in examples of justice and liberality. Now this, unlike with the Baptists, was a dream that would have to wait quite a while. Strong anti-Catholic sentiment influenced American politics well into the 20th century, as you might remember with the controversies over John F. Kennedy's campaign for president and the concerns about America having a Catholic president.
You would be divided between two loyalties to your church and to your state if you were to be elected president.
Article 6 of the Constitution says there shall be no religious test for office. That's what was written in the Constitution. Jefferson, Washington, and all the rest. They said every American will have an opportunity. Now, you cannot tell me that the day I was born it was said I could never run for president because I wouldn't meet my oath of office.
That really wasn't something people were expressing concerns about when Joe Biden was running for president. Now, they might have had all sorts of other reasons why they were concerned about Joe Biden being president, but him being Catholic was not a topic of widespread discussion. So things have changed. But for Catholics in America, this was a long, hard road, and not one that could be easily waved away. Not even with the First Amendment, but we'll have to talk about that more. Now let's talk about another letter that Washington received from Jews in Rhode Island. America's oldest synagogue can be found in Newport, Rhode Island, where about 25 Jewish families lived when Washington became president. In August of 1790, Washington visited Newport, and a number of clergy and others representing different religious groups in Newport gave addresses to the U.S. president and to others assembled to listen to them, presumably. Congregation Yeshuat Israel was no exception to this. Moses Satius, who was a prominent merchant in town and the warden of the synagogue, gave their address to Washington. And Satius coined a phrase in his address that became one of the most influential in American understanding about what church and state might look like. Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the almighty disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming every one, of whatever nation, tongue, or language, equal parts of the great governmental machine. Now, this was, of course, following the adoption of the Bill of Rights. So they are reflecting on the rights granted to them under the First Amendment. But that doesn't mean that the First Amendment would be interpreted and applied necessarily evenly or in the same ways as we might expect it to be today. George Washington, in any case, must have appreciated that phrase, and he echoed it. The idea of to bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance has been one of the most quoted things that Washington ever said about church and state, and has been very influential in the ways that Americans have understood the meaning of the First Amendment. So Washington used very similar language in the letter that he wrote back to this congregation in Rhode Island. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. This last letter became Washington's best-known articulation of his views of church and state, and is viewed as his clearest exposition on what he thought the relationship between religion and government should be. Now, I've said the Baptists did well, Catholics not so well. Jews also had a lot of difficulty, and this ideal of to bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance didn't really play out in American history.
Do you follow the Hebrew religion yourself, or is it that you just want to make sure?
I've asked a simple question. I'd like to have a simple answer.
Well, you see, we do have a very high-class clientele, and, well, naturally.
Then you do restrict your guests to Gentiles?
Well, I wouldn't say that, Mr. Green. But in any event, there seems to be some mistake, because we don't have a free room in the entire hotel.
There has been plenty of bigotry and persecution that the government of the United States has both supported and sanctioned. It's important to note that despite Washington's continual assertions that liberalism were the grounding principle of his governance, that didn't necessarily play out in his personal life or in American history writ large. It wasn't something that people necessarily got to experience in real time. And as I sort of hinted at there, that didn't even work out for Washington. A lot of people in the aftermath of the American Revolution used the rhetoric to push Americans to rethink the practice of slavery, of enslaving people. That was a problem for people who had advocated for the overthrow of the British government on the basis that it was enslaving them, with the understanding, of course, that enslaving people is bad and it gives people the right to just start over. So push for emancipation was strong. But Washington enslaved many people, and he did not emancipate the people he enslaved until his death in 1799, which didn't take effect until his wife, Martha Washington, actually signed that into effect in 1800. So the revolution was about individual human rights in many ways, and the Bill of Rights is specifically about the rights of individuals. And it would seem to contradict the practice of slavery, but the U.S. government really didn't want to take that on for a variety of reasons that this video is not going to be able to tackle because it's beyond the scope of what I can do in a day. But I do want to acknowledge, as much as Washington had said these things and as much influence as he had, it just didn't play out that way for quite a while. Knowing Better has done a fascinating deep dive into the history of American slavery and how it persisted much longer than most of us were really ever taught. So I will link to that video, and if you want to look into that, like I say, it's a great video, shows how American slavery lasted well into the 20th century. If you go over there and watch that video, please tell him that I sent you. Washington himself enslaved people for 56 years, and many states were very reluctant to adopt the kind of principles that Washington advocated. The last state-established church to fall didn't fall until 1833. That was Massachusetts. Again, more stories we can examine another time. So, tell me what you think of Washington's views, and maybe tell me if you know of other examples where the United States has offered bigotry sanction and persecution assistance. Who knows? Maybe I will follow some of your leads and we can talk about some of those things here too. Until next time then, I want to thank each and every one of my real and imaginary friends for joining me again. And if you'd like to see the other videos I have on American presidents, you can watch the playlist that this is a part of. So until next time, to my imaginary friends, please stay safe and stay curious, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye!